Hello, and welcome to my attempt at a new format for these videos. Hopefully, I should be able to do things like this, and that, by just flying things into this video. Anyway, let's get started. Today we're talking about World War I, in particular, its background and its causes. We're going to get deep into that. The subtitle there is Machine Guns, Ships, and Chivalry, which primarily has to do with the fact that machine guns were new, ships were really important for why the war started, and chivalry was the reason why it turned out to be an incredibly awful war to be a soldier in. So, how do you study a historical event? Well, first you look at the people, and then you look at society, and then you look at mentalite, and then technology, geography, and politics, and causes. It's an enormous undertaking. So, basically, people, that's referring to the major figures. You're studying individuals and their motives and actions. Society is studying the masses, like everybody else in the world and what they were doing, and on the whole, what were they like. Mentalité is a French word which in history gets at the idea of the worldview, the things that those people believed, that the society believed. Technology is important here not just because of what it allows, as in like the actual things that a piece of technology does, but also how people use it and how people integrate it into their lives. And then there's geography, which includes both the physical and the social. Physical meaning like mountains and trees and natural resources, and the social meaning the locations of cultures and the spread of languages, and which is really important for understanding nationalism, as we have talked about a little bit before. So politics is looking at diplomacy and alliances and treaties and secret agreements and all that stuff. And the causes are a way of bringing that all together, taking all of those and putting it in one thing, and you make an argument about what you think each of those elements had took role to play in all of that. Now, in history and in social science, really, there's a lot of different ways of going into studying these different elements. And in particular, different kinds of social science take up different parts of this task. Biography looks at the people, and that's part of history. Sociology looks at the society as a whole and uses scientific methods to uncover what those societies were like. There's psychology handles the mentalité, what people believed and why they believed and where that comes from. Technology is both the science, like I was saying, how it all works and how it doesn't work. And sociology, because it's how people make use of that technology and how it changes the way people live. Then there's the geography aspect for geography. That's what geographers do. For politics, it's international relations, also general political science. And all of those fields together help come up with the causes. And historians do a lot of like pushing things together, trying to make it all make sense. So where do you begin when talking about World War I? You begin before World War I begins, which makes sense. A lot of beginning. So what was Europe like before World War I? Well, the technology had been changing rapidly, incredibly rapidly, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, like we talked about before. But now there's some core technologies that made a huge difference right at the beginning of the war. And that's guns, the development from just having cruddy little muskets where you had to light a little fuse and touch it into the powder, it was terrible, to machine guns, which could fire off hundreds and hundreds of rounds a minute. That changed the way battlefields work. Instead of lining up as a bunch of troops and having to march, you were hiding down in a hole because there were hundreds of bullets whizzing by at any second, and you were definitely going to get hit because they were also rifled, as in they were spinning the bullets, which makes them more accurate and they could travel farther. So, there's also steam and railroads. Steam is important both for the industry aspect, the way it was used to manufacture more things, and also, in the case of railroads and steamships, to move people and goods much more quickly. So society had changed a lot also. The factory system and urbanization had fundamentally altered the way cities worked and the way the relationship between cities and the countryside. The Gilded Age is a way of talking about the kind of wealth inequality and deeply problematic, troublesome bits of capitalism that rose to the top during this time period and created a lot of social unrest. But there was expanded education, which is important because in this era, during World War I and up before that, there's a lot of impressive propaganda that makes its debut, and some of it was visual, but a lot of it, required reading. And so, even though people were more educated, it's interesting to realize that they were still capable of going to war. Education does not lessen war necessarily. There are also strong central governments capable of organizing enormous amounts of people and goods and material, both to create large industries and consistent, stable societies, but also to make huge wars on one another.
All right, now let's take a look at this map of Europe. And as you can see there in the blue, right, the light blue, that's the German Empire, which had been unified in 1871. And in the purple there, that's France. You can see Russia, the huge area that includes Warsaw and what is most of now Poland. Austria-Hungary down there in the sort of yellowish zone. The United Kingdom up there in the orange, and the Scandinavian countries above that. Spain, who did not serve a large part in this war, Italy down there in the light green, and the Ottoman Empire down to the far right. And you can see the area of Europe that had the most small countries in it. It was definitely the area around Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and Greece. And in fact, it was those small countries that managed to start World War I. And this is just to give you a view of this map. We will work more with the geography in class. So to get to this idea of mentalité, the worldview of the people who lived at the time, I'm going to read a little bit from Stuart Robson's The First World War. What matters in history is not only what happens, but also what people think happens or has happened. People living in 1914 thought that peace was normal because the wars since 1850 had been brief and peripheral to their lives. War for most people had become war imagined. At the same time, without reality as a check, war had become idealized as a test not just of state power, but also of the moral strength of individuals and nations. Social changes encouraged this perception. Modernization arrived in force after 1870 in an era that Norman Stone has called the Great Transformation. People were on the move, literally, with 30 million Europeans migrating outside of Europe and 60 million more moving into the cities of Europe. They were also trying to move socially, climbing the new ladder of urban society. The idea of chivalry had an important revival in the Victorian era. Middle-class men found emotional satisfaction in imagining themselves to be knights in shining armor. It was not just a matter of a taste for literature set in the Middle Ages, but a way of expressing the ideal of a gentleman. A gentleman devoted his life to fair play and to helping others. In this deliberately old-fashioned view of life, war served as the ultimate test of character. The gentleman warrior, schooled on the playing fields of the public schools, put his life on the line for the sake of honor. Cowards and bullies thought only for themselves and their narrow, selfish interests. They broke the rules, violated the spirit of the game, and so, of course, they lost, whatever the final score. It was not just against the cads that the gentleman knight defined himself. What he did could not be done by women. Men made war, and war made men. It was the surest way to define masculinity and test character. The cult of the gentleman rationalized the violence and terror of war by treating death as the ultimate challenge. War was imagined to be a purgative as well as a test. It was assumed to be the opposite of peace and therefore free of the sins that peace had acquired: individualism, materialism, cynicism, uncertainty, aimlessness, and boredom. Eric Lead argues that people welcomed the war as an escape from the dispiriting realities of the new industrialized world. They did not realize that war itself would be industrialized. It would not provide an escape from the mechanized routine, but only an intensification of it.
So people in politics, this is Kaiser Wilhelm II and Woodrow Wilson are the two that we're going to focus on here because they're in the SOLs. But there are an enormous number of very interesting characters who go into World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm.
Now this is a fascinating guy. He was related to just about every other monarch in Europe, which makes for some uncomfortable family situations when then you go to war with them. What you can't see in this picture is that he has a withered left arm. And that contrasts sharply with the role that he played in German history, where he sold himself from a young age. He was, being bred to be emperor. And he tried to portray himself as this martial gentleman figure, as this warrior king. But then he had this physical deformity, and that made for a kind of an interesting psyche on this guy. He is often blamed for, in part, starting World War I because he often postured very warlike, and people tried to blame the beginning of the war on him for not backing down, basically.
And then also, let's take a look at Woodrow Wilson.
Now, Woodrow Wilson is also a fascinating character, and there's way more on him than we could cover in this short period of time. But he's the 28th president of the United States. He was in office from 1913 until 1921, and he managed to keep the United States out of the war until 1917. He had very strong anti-war leanings, but as a result of German submarine attacks on ships with U.S. citizens in them, and the fact that Germany sent a telegram called the Zimmermann telegram that attempted to get Mexico to attack the U.S. and offered them some compensation of land in order to do so, it was pretty clear the United States had to declare war. But he claimed that he was declaring war, asking Congress to do so, to make the world safe for democracy. And that terminology, keeping the world safe for democracy, has become the sort of mainstay of United States war policy since. But it should also be mentioned about Woodrow Wilson. Despite all of his pacifist leanings, he also resegregated the White House, as in racially. And he opposed women's voting rights for a long time. And there's lots more that doesn't sit well with the common image of Wilson. But again, we'll get to talk more about that.
Okay, now let's take a look at this timeline. And you can see on this timeline that the origins of World War I had deep roots in the 1800s. And realistically, even before this timeline, there were lots of important events that bear on the beginning of World War I. In particular, the rise of the industrial system and the sort of ordering of the world in terms of colonies and who owned who, which is, problematic as it is. So take a look at this map. This is the system of alliances that was in place right before the start of World War I. In particular, you can see who was in the what are called the Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance there in red. You can see in sort of blue-purple the Triple Entente, and those were the two factions that were just about to end up at war with one another. But it was the political system that had tied them together that made it possible for this war to erupt into a global war. Now, the causes, in the long term, those alliances, like we had talked about, were an incredibly important cause because it both forced some countries to participate and gave the excuse to some countries to get involved in the war in pursuit of their own goals. Sometimes those goals didn't make any sense or weren't logical or they had no chance of obtaining them, but they were still their goals. Nationalism played a huge part because the fervor to go to war and to fight for one's country was one of the reasons that countries were able to field such large armies and to keep them going for so long, even in the face of horrible, horrible conditions for soldiers and the civilian population. Diplomacy being outweighed by militarism is incredibly important because you recognize that this militaristic idea that you can solve your problems or at least gain through military combat made diplomacy not a terribly useful tool once you had started to mobilize your troops and everyone knew that you were at least intending to go to war and that you could go to war. So militarism, or the tendency towards military actions, was an incredibly important long-term cause. Also imperialism, the drive for colonies and the economic stuff that comes along with having colonies, have access to natural resources, the improved industry, and that colonial competition, part of imperialism, was a big deal. But also imperialism as in maintaining an empire, which was the case in Austria-Hungary, and also the case for Russia, that by the end their empires broke up. Oh, so did the Ottoman Empire. And basically, if they'd won the war, it probably wouldn't have happened that way. The British Empire stayed together, for instance. Short term, though, the immediate causes, as they're sometimes called, unrest in the Balkans, which, if you were also alive during the 90s, which I know I was, you might be familiar with the Balkans. They're an area with a lot of various interesting ethnic groups that have had tensions for a very long time. It's been the place of intercultural warfare for a long time. But the most immediate cause, the thing that was cited by the powers that be as they were going to war, was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip. Now, he was a Serbian nationalist, in fact, part of a secret society that was advocating the rise of a greater Serbian nation.
And I'm sorry for the abrupt cut there, but I am still learning how to use this program. So I hope you've appreciated this week's video, and I look forward to seeing you in class.